Great. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Good morning, everyone. This is day 2 of the State Bar Board of Trustees regular meeting for March 2022. It is just a few minutes after 9 o'clock, and we are convening an open session after having conducted a closed session at the close of yesterday's long day of business. Thank you to all of you for your stamina and your energy. Just to need a little bit more to get through the rest of our agenda today. I will note for the record that we considered the items that were on the closed session agenda, except for one, which we will take up after a strategic planning session this morning. Madam General Counsel, please confirm that there's nothing reportable from our discussions in closed session yesterday. She says yes, so we're good. Okay, may we have the roll, please?
Broughton,
Here.
Chen,
Here.
Cisneros,
Here.
De La Cruz, Dellen,
She says she's here.
Thank you. Duran,
Here.
Slug, Shelby, Soul,
Present.
Stallings,
Here.
Tony.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Okay, our first and only business item today in the open session is the continuation of our strategic planning session. Many thanks to all of you for the time and effort you've put into getting us where we are here. I believe I am going to hand the microphone over to Ms. Wilson and or Ms. Pye. So let's get those folks loaded into the virtual meeting room and away we go.
Yes, I am not seeing the LPA team. Are they?
They're coming.
Oh.
They're being promoted.
There we go.
How's that?
Good morning. Hi, Cassandra. We can see you.
Oh, good morning. Look at you in the room. You look official. It's nice to see you there. Okay, I think I can see everybody. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
We can.
All right, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Ms. Wilson and all others. I think we're going to pull up a deck as a part of this presentation. I'll wait for that before I start.
Give me just one moment.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Great, okay. Good morning again. We're going to do just a few things this morning, hopefully that gets us to a final motion to approve this document and the strategic plan. And thankfully, I'm going to be able to enlist the support of a number of trustees as well as some of the staff to help work through this. We can go to the next slide, please. We just wanted to, for the sake of record and also for the public to just get a sense of where we started and how we got to this process, which began late last year, most of it online and most of it virtually, but a couple of meetings in person. We were graciously given the talents of 3 members of the board to help us with the working group and sort of help us move the process forward. So I want to express my thanks to those 3 gentlemen and also to the staff, and just outline the process that we went through. 6 working group meetings, which also led to interviews of all the trustees, interviews with stakeholders in the judicial branch, 4 legislative branch interviews, surveys of 3,700 state bar licensees. There was a very thorough staff assessment survey that was led by Ms. Lyles and really well done, as well as a public survey and surveys of 35 sub-entities. And all of that led to what I like to call a collection of a lot of data and input, which we then really rolled through pretty rigorously, several working group meetings, and that allowed us to put together first identify issues, but then also develop a very, we think, thorough agenda for the strategic planning session in January. It was a 2-day session. The Board of Trustees able to spend a little time getting to know each other's backgrounds a little bit better, establish some really good trust and goodwill. And that led to yet another set of working group meetings where we were able to start to put a plan together. And so our final working group meeting took place after the February meeting that led to the development of the document that you're going to take a look at today. I think the only other thing I want to call out before we go into that part of the presentation is that the board said to us, to me, as your facilitator, that you wanted the plan to be high level and strategic and not get too far into the weeds. And I think we did a really good job there, but we also took into account all that feedback that we just outlined. What we're going to do today, and I think this has just worked so well because of the input of the board as well as the hard work of the staff, is talk about goals, talk about strategies, but we're also going to use some time to start to talk a little bit about implementation steps too. Just the right way to do it, in our opinion. And so we will have staff support us today in talking about implementation steps. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, please. And I won't read through this, but I'll give you a chance to do so. The thing I want to call out on the 22 to 27 goals is that there is in addition to realizing the vision and a mission for the next 5 years, we called out in this preamble, if you will, a commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion with respect to operations, as well as with respect to the legal profession itself. And we thought it was important to pull that to the top of the document and make it clear that that commitment to DEI is going to make its way, or weave its way, if you will, through all of the work the bar does over the next 5 years. So 4 goals: protect the public by strengthening the attorney discipline system, protect the public by enhancing access to and inclusion in the legal system, protect the public by regulating the legal profession, and protect the public by engaging partners, were the 4 goals that the State Bar Board outlined. And so if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. And Mr. Tony is going to take a few minutes to talk through goal 1. We'll talk about strategies, and then we'll turn it over to a member of the staff, and that's going to be Mr. Cardona, to talk through the implementation steps. So Mr. Tony.
Thank you, Cassandra. I'm going to step in, Mark. I apologize. Thank you for setting the table for us. I forgot to ask for public comment. So we're going to take a little break here, a little sojourn, to double check with the secretary to see if there's any member of the public who wishes to address the board this morning on our agenda item or on any other item of business within the State Bar's jurisdiction.
I see one hand raised by Pete Bennett.
Good morning, Mr. Bennett. Just a reminder, sir, that we open public comment and we welcome public comment on any item of business that we're discussing today, or any item of business within the State Bar's jurisdiction. So if you could limit your comments to those areas, I would very much appreciate it. You may start.
I'm waiting. Is it opened up?
It is, yes. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Pete Bennett. I have a 40-year history, or actually 45-year history. I even got a case law in Florida with my friends that were killed in 1975. Now, why is it important? It's been going on for a long time. I've had my attorney's office burned down. I've had my attorney beaten up in Walnut Creek in 2005. I had a Bennett versus Collins. Mr. Collins was murdered. Okay. My attorney's son was killed in the county jail. Different attorney, by the way, all of them. The brother-in-law of my attorney, Dax Craven, that was disbarred, was killed. He could be my stepson, by the way. I have been in the courtroom where one judge hurled $20,000 in fines on my license for 16 years. In between all that, I was being beaten up and arrested. And I worked on Oracle versus PeopleSoft. It's a fraud. And I worked on the PG&E explosion. And Kirkland and Ellis deliberately kept me from reporting to the ethics lines regarding the compliance with the criminal conviction of PG&E. I know who blew up the pipeline. That's what's going on. I deserve remedy. You might as well set aside your entire trust fund for my damages. I'm not kidding. And by the way, just so you know, I got a job at Wells Fargo Bank when the programmer jumped off the Bay Bridge. I know Paul Hazen. Get your money out of Wells Fargo. It's sitting on ice. It's not a good bank. Okay, so your bar association and my losses, substantial losses, loss of life, loss of attorneys. And Attorney Jay Ryan was killed in downtown Martinez 6 years ago.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
I got barely that much left in my life. I have been run over by the legal system, destroyed financially, and my friends and family are being killed. I will show you 150 cases of murder or suspicious death. Way out of control. Way out of control. It should never have gone on this long.
Your time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. If there is no other member of the public who wants to address the board, we will resume with Trustee Tony giving us everything we want to know about Goal 1, please.
By chance.
I don't think there is, unfortunately.
It's actually posted to the public agenda.
All right. Let me go get to it then. Oh, 708. Okay, I've got 708. Give me a second. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Pye. I'm Mark Tony and was part of the Strategic Planning Committee. And so I want to talk about goal number 1, which is protect the public by strengthening the attorney discipline system. There's a reason this is goal number 1, because it is the bar's responsibility, the state bar's responsibility to administer an attorney discipline system that is efficient, accountable, and transparent. The vision here is that the state bar discipline system is recognized as effective, fair, and especially timely. So the 5-year plan strategies here have 4 elements. First element is effectiveness, to adopt new case processing standards and improved operational practices, to focus resources on cases posing the most significant risks of harm, and at the same time, and to reduce the backlog of unresolved disciplinary cases. It's particularly important that is number 1, because the state bar realizes The board here realizes the importance of both prioritizing the most damaging complaints that impact the greatest number of the public and our need to reduce the backlog of unresolved disciplinary cases. So the second is consumer focus, to assist the public in navigating the complaint process and seeking fair, appropriate, and timely resolution. The third is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is to continue to address any racial or other disparities in the attorney discipline system. This is to make sure that we don't have a discipline system that inadvertently disadvantages Black male attorneys, as has been raised as a concern previously, and that we make sure that all attorneys get a fair shake and the due process they deserve while we are protecting the public. And the final is policy and systems change to respond to emerging issues regarding attorney misconduct and promote solutions to increase public protection. This is particularly important because this final element is one that expresses dynamism, that we have to be able within the 5 years to be nimble from a policy standpoint and respond to changing conditions. So I'd like to open this up. Is it appropriate to open it up to discussion now? I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing.
I think so, or we have the next level down, the implementation steps for goal 1, maybe the discussion after George was gonna
Thank you for
walk
reminding
through
me.
some of the highlights
Please,
there.
George, would you please join us and help me out here? Thank you.
Go to the next slide. This is kind of a step down in terms of more detail as to how some of the things thinking about in terms of implementation in each of these 4 areas. And as you'll see, but from looking at these, many of these are already underway. So as you know from our rather lengthy discussion yesterday, we are well along the way in terms of developing and implementing new case processing standards. And that's something that hopefully will be before you in May. In terms of a well-resourced, motivated, and accountable prosecutorial workforce, that's something that we're continually working on in terms of accountability and in particular. As you know, we've recently started reporting to the board on a regular basis about the audit of closed cases. We expect that will continue, and we'll look for other ways to be as transparent and accountable as we can. We're also looking at and continuing to consider ways that we might restructure how we do our work within the office to be more efficient and effective and encourage people to do what we need to do on the cases. In terms of the case management system, that's an area where there is ongoing work. We continue to try and work with our case management system, not only the data that's in the case management system, but also ways to use that data to generate reports that are more useful using other mechanisms. Consumer focus, another area we're looking at. How do we be more responsive to individuals who wish to file complaints? How do we assist them in getting their information into the system and addressing it afterwards? As you know, we have ongoing efforts to educate communities about the unauthorized practice of law and encourage reporting of that, particularly in areas where we see that the most, in particular, efforts to victimize immigrant populations with unauthorized practice of law. In terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've already implemented some of the changes that the board authorized. For example, archiving closed complaints that are more than 5 years old, and are continuing to monitor to see if actions we're taking have unintended racial disparities or other disparities in the system. And finally, on the last policy and systems change, we will await the recommendations of both of these committees and look to work with the board to try and align those in a way that makes sense in terms of moving forward and ensure that we are in fact effectively investigating attorneys at all levels. One of the complaints has been that we focus too much on attorneys in small firms or solo practice. So we're looking at that to see if there are ways to ensure that we are actually looking at complaints against attorneys in other situations as well. So that probably took more time than I was supposed to, but
No, that was fine. Thank you, George. Really appreciate it. So at this point, why don't we open it up to questions, comments, thoughts that any of the board members might have? Halen, I'll just keep calling on people.
So, thank you for this thoughtful presentation. I have a question about what we mean by transparency or transparent as articulated in goal number 1. And I think George answered that question by explaining the ways in which the discipline system would be transparent and talking about implementation. But I wonder whether we should, you know, the idea of transparency isn't really repeated elsewhere in the goal other than in the top line. And I wonder whether we need to move some concept of transparency or repeat it in other areas in our articulation of the strategies as well as implementation. Also the concept of accountability. I had a question about that, but I think George, you answered it in talking about implementation. So I do wonder whether on implementation, it's not just effectiveness, but there's also accountability and transparency. We kind of need to explain how we're going to do that.
Thank you. I think that's very, very useful feedback. Trustee Chen, thank you. Other comments, thoughts?
Mr. Sol's hand is up.
Yes, Trustee Soul.
I also just want to say, thanks so much for the work that you and other members of the staff and that the board did on this, as well as to Cassandra and you and your team. I have a question that maybe is a little bit more overarching, which I appreciate if somebody would just give me a refresher on this. As I look through these implementation steps, I'm just wondering when are our milestones in terms of check-in on these? Because we need to hold ourselves accountable for making progress on this roadmap and on the strategic plan. And I've just forgotten what the cadence is on when we do the check on ourselves in terms of how we're doing.
So
Go ahead, Leah. I was going to say it's a great question. It's something we talked about as a team, but please, Leah.
right. So historically, how it's been structured is twice a year, there's a formal update to the board in a public meeting as an update on strategic plan status. But that is all really to be determined by this board. So that's what we've done in the past. I think there are many different modalities for tracking implementation progress, and we could talk about what the board wants to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Tony.
Chair Duran.
And I might add, and maybe I'm just thinking about the 2 times per year that you mentioned specifically, but I have noticed over the years that you very often weave into your work here at the board in public how whatever's on the table relates to or feeds off of our strategic plan. And I'm assuming that's a very deliberate and purposeful thing that you do, separate and apart from those formal updates and reports. And I certainly have appreciated over the years. And if the board wants to continue to see that, I hope you will do it.
Trustee Stallings.
Thank you, Trustee Tony. So as I was reading through the implementation steps, I was really hit with this idea that, there's always room for improvement. There is always room to continue to push the ball forward in this expanse of what does it mean to have an effective and a fair justice system. And I think it's worth noting that the state bar has taken on a very complex issue in regards to disparate impact among racial minorities in our system. And this really was a policy directive. It was really started by Leah Wilson several years ago, and it's something that has required an enormous amount of staff, resources, and visioneering. And so I really see this, the implementation of Goal 1 as a continued step in us examining this, and really, frankly, being one of the only bar association in the United States to take on this very complex issue. So I just want to really call out staff for the excellent work that they've done in pushing this. And I look at the policy and systems change, which is align recommendations of the Special Discipline Case Audit Committee and Ad Hoc Commission, and really, the work of Justin Ewart, Lisa Chavez, Lori Malak, and really aligning all these different issues that we talk about and making sure that at the end of the day, everybody is somewhat on the same page and we're all working towards that same goal of justice and protecting the public. And so, like I said, there's room for improvement, but I think we really need to reflect on what got us to this stage and to be grateful for staff for the hard work that they've done.
Not to lose sight of what Trustee Chen talked about with respect to transparency, and I agree with you that it jumps off of or feeds into the accountability aspect of what we do. As Trustee Tony introduced to us, this is really job one for us in terms of making sure that our attorney discipline system is adaptive and responsive and ethical and all of those things. I almost feel like accountability, transparency rather, is endemic to us as a public agency. And when we're talking about the discipline system, I have to remind myself that there are aspects of that system that necessarily, statutorily and for lots of other reasons, are confidential with respect to attorneys going through the process until that process results in some public discipline and some public proceeding. And I don't know whether or how we can encapsulate that fine balance in the materials that are here, other than committing to continue to communicate with the many different players, for lack of a better word, in our world, right? The state bar court staff, the legislative partners that we work with who are very interested in making sure that our agency is responsive to the public and protecting the public. I don't have the answer, but I feel like it's in our DNA, and maybe we should acknowledge that somehow. I don't know that it fits necessarily in any of the 4 strategies that we're talking about.
So
Go ahead.
if it's okay.
Please.
I agree that it's endemic, but I think it's endemic in the plan itself. So there are lots of ways that even within the discipline system, we can demonstrate transparency. And I think they're reflected to some extent here in Goal 1, but they're also reflected in Goal 4. But for example, assisting members of the public needing assistance in submitting complaints and resolving problems. This is the concept of, in part, of having an ombuds position. That has to do with making transparent what comprises a viable complaint, right? Because people don't know. How do you navigate this process? We're opening sort of a window into how our discipline system works. Brandon highlighted the work we've done on racial disparities, and that's included on DEI. But just the fact that we've lifted that up demonstrates a level of transparency that no other licensing agency has engaged in, and we continue to call it out. So I think that is both transparency and accountability. So I agree the words aren't there, but I think that it really is embedded. And then in Goal 4, which I'm going to speak to, that has to do with being transparent in our communications as a way of increasing our credibility. And although there are lots of constraints on the discipline side, one thing I've really appreciated about George is he's sort of pushed the boundaries of the constraints when we respond to the media, for example. And I think that helps us. So there are many ways I think that we demonstrate it, we can and we do, and it's reflected here in goal 1, but also again in goal 4.
Thank you. If I could make one other comment, I wanted to respond to Trustee Sowell's question about, which is an overall question about the entire strategic plan and how the board engages with it. My suggestion would be in January of each year that we set aside time to review, and not just to hear reports, but to have a conversation about how we're doing and whether there may be any modifications we may want to make to the strategic plan. Because a strategic plan really needs to be a living, breathing document and not something that a board adopts and doesn't engage with on a regular basis. And I actually think that twice a year is too often to engage with it. We should hear reports, don't get me wrong, but in terms of actually engaging with it, you need a year's passage of time to be able to see, and it corresponds with our program year, which ends in in December of each year. So that'd be my suggestion. We don't have to decide today, but I wanted to be responsive to Trustee Sowell's question by hazarding my own thoughts. Other questions, please? Oh, yes, Trustee
Sorry,
Stallings. Go
And
ahead.
Trustee Tony, to your point, in years past, we've had almost as a standing item on various committees where we're at in our strategic plan as far as implementation of our goals.
Great.
And so I think each committee can own certain aspects and should own certain aspects of the strategic plan. For instance, RAD will take an enormous leadership role in the implementation of goals 1 and 2.
Mhm.
And so I think that can be implemented into their specific work plan. And I think really those committees can then go through and do that fine, in the weeds work, and then report back to the board on the status of implementation.
Excellent. Chair Duran?
Thank you, Trustee Tony. I agree with you that this document should be, a living, breathing document, not just put on a shelf or left on a thumb drive. I'm not sure that I agree that it should be something that is, changed often or regularly, because the value to me in having a strategic plan that lays out a 5-year program is that our staff, us on the board, we know sort of what those long-term goals are, and we're working toward them. I hesitate to move the goalposts, and maybe that's not what you're suggesting, and probably it's not, but I do like the idea of knowing that this vision that we're collectively going to agree on today is something that sort of is a North Star. Certainly, if there's something that's not working or is producing problems, we should revisit it and change it. But I hesitate to be very amending it very often. That was really bad grammar, but
We have done that, and I think there is actually a statutory requirement, if I'm correct, I'm looking at Donna, I think that we reconsider our strategic plan every 2 years.
that's what it is.
And we have used the January planning session for exactly what Trustee Tony is talking about and have made amendments. I think we would likely, be conservative about amending the goal itself, but
agree.
implementation
Sure.
steps certainly.
Yeah.
So,
And Chair Duran, I'm glad to hear we're in complete alignment on this issue. Complete 100% alignment. Thank you.
Great.
Other trustees have any other comments? I thank you for your time.
Mr. Chairman, I believe Mr. Stallings is going to take on goal number 2. And he's going to be joined by Ms. Herskovitz to take over the implementation segment.
All right, good morning, everyone. So in 2019, as we've discussed, the legislature made this aspect of our strategic plan, which is protect the public by enhancing access to and inclusion in the legal system, an integral part of the State Bar's public protection mission. And uh, it was really a codification of what I believe to be the heart and soul of the work that the State Bar does, and really is the driving force for a lot of the regulatory reform that we conduct internally and then also externally through support or lending support for various bills going through the legislature. And we heard a report yesterday of various initiatives, various pieces of legislation that we're supporting regarding law student incentive or incentivizing law students working in the public sector, loan repayment assistance, and the support for attorneys through the LAP program. And all of these things really go to the State Bar's role, and in our discussions, the State Bar's leadership role in advancing access to and inclusion in the legal system here in California. As a group, we talked about the differences between being merely a data collector and an organization who really does act to direct other organizations to partner with other organizations, and all with the same goal of enhancing access to and inclusion in the legal system. Staff has done an incredible job in foreseeing areas that we can continue to improve in. And I think that our strategic plan really speaks to ways that we can continue to increase representation through the State Bar's existing regulatory and oversight authority by expanding special admissions and encouraging pro bono practice programs. That goes to our effectiveness component. We talked about in the consumer focus area, increasing public education, outreach and awareness to close the knowledge gap and connect consumers to relevant legal resources. DEI, the third prong, is inextricably intertwined all throughout of our strategic plan, which again, I think speaks to the leadership role that the State Bar should continue to take. And in this area, we've partnered with many incredible organizations, just to name one, COAF, who is working with this law school pipeline program to really foster a diverse legal profession. And this is, I forget who coined the phrase, but I'll attribute it to Leah, but this, it's not this bolted on approach that the bar is taking, but it really is a fully integrated approach to advancing diversity, equity, inclusion in the legal profession. And it starts at an early stage with individuals who have a burning heart for working in the public sector to try and right injustices and to really speak to communities where they have a heart to serve in. So the State Bar is in a very good position to continue to advance really those deep passions that are shared by Californians, by people who wish to serve underrepresented individuals and underrepresented geographic areas as well. And our support of various legislative reforms, I think, really speaks to that, that baked in, not bolted on approach. And so then in regards to the policy and systems change, we continue to identify and advocate for innovative policy and regulatory reforms needed to increase access to the legal services. And we spoke at length during the planning session about reaching out to historically disenfranchised communities. And my heart really is for the rural community because that's where I live, and I see the incredible and growing need for legal services in these rural areas. And so the State Bar continues to work to address those issues, and really all with the vision that all Californians have access to high quality, affordable, and culturally competent legal advice and services. And so that's the vision. That's I believe, a very obtainable goal that we've set for ourselves for the next 5 years. And I will hand it over to Donna to tell us how we're going to get there.
Thank you so much, Brandon, members of the board. I'm super excited about so many of these implementation steps that it's hard for me to pick out just a few to talk to you about, but that is what I'm going to endeavor to do right now. And Brandon has highlighted several of them, which helps me just mention a few of them. Demonstrating effectiveness. One of the items that you see here is
incentivizing and supporting licensees and law firms to increase the number of pro bono hours. The State Bar's Office of Access and Inclusion has been wanting for a couple of years now to present a pro bono strategy of what we are going to do to increase pro bono. And they are excited to be forced to spend the time to put that forward by having it on the strategic plan. And they've really established in the past couple of years an incredibly strong relationship with the Legal Services Community Access Commission, Legal Aid Association of California, and will be able to work collaboratively in coming up with a pro bono strategy that I think we would all agree ultimately is seeking to increase the amount of pro bono that we can provide to support low and moderate income Californians. You'll see a very small piece of that coming up probably at the May board meeting with some rule changes to our pro bono practice program. So that will be the start of those changes to the pro bono of their new pro bono strategy. Looking at the consumer focus, one of the things that jumps out is the attempts to better understand the knowledge gap and to develop strategies to address barriers to consumers facing difficulty securing legal services. Knowledge gap, as we know, is one piece of the justice gap, the service gap being the other piece. The knowledge gap is that people don't even know that something they have is in fact a legal problem. And that's been a hard nut to crack. How do you provide legal help to those who don't even understand what they are facing as a legal problem? As some of the more tenured members of the board may recall, with the separation of the Access Commission from the State Bar, we have entered into an annual deliverables-based contract with the Access Commission to work with us on access priorities. And one of the things that is in this year's contract that we are working on is coming up with a media strategy in order to address the knowledge gap in focusing on key areas of the law and key constituencies and trying to provide that information so we could then provide the services once people understand that their issues in fact do have a legal component or are maybe very heavily legal issues. On the under the diversity, equity, inclusion heading, and I say it that way because so far I think everything I've talked about also includes diversity, equity, and inclusion pieces of it. But under the heading here, I'll point to two of the items which are about increasing the diversity of attorneys in the profession and law school retention in law school of diverse attorneys. We, the State Bar, working in conjunction with the California Accredited and Registered Law Schools, changed the reporting requirements. So we are now tracking the recruitment and the retention, particularly of diverse law students in the California Accredited and Registered Law School. It was data that we didn't used to have, and we rolled out a 3-year plan to phase in adding these additional data elements so we could begin tracking this information. And the annual report that will come out from those law schools this fall, it contains that final phase 3, where we will have all of the updated information and will allow us to really dig in to some of the differences in law school's ability to retain students of diverse backgrounds, and then figure out what are the best practices. Why is one law school able to retain at a rate that is significantly different than another law school? This will buttress the findings of our law school retention study, which I think you'll see coming out probably in 2 or 3 months, which looks at those issues as well. So very exciting things on that front to increase the diversity of a profession by focusing on the law school to admission pipeline. And then on the policy and systems change, the item that I was going to highlight, Brandon actually mentioned in his comments, which is the attention that we spent yesterday talking about development of a loan repayment assistance program, which will be an important policy change in order to make legal aid a more attractive and sustainable career goal. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions along with Brandon.
All right, does anybody have any questions for Donna or myself?
Is there a second page of implementation related to DEI? Or is that,
There is.
oh, that's for someone else.
No, I think Louisa just didn't advance the slide. Donna,
Oh.
there is second page.
Okay.
So as you see, we have a lot on our plate for implementation. All right, anybody have any questions?
Mr. Broughton's hand is raised.
Yes, Mr. Broughton.
Yes, Brandon, you kind of mentioned this a little bit in some of your comments. And one of the things about access to justice, and I realize we're at the State Bar and we're looking primarily at our consumers and the attorneys. But one of the things that's important to me, at least, in access to justice for the public is having the proper facilities, that is to say, judges and courtrooms and things like that, you know, that you've heard me speak about many times in the past. And again, Brandon and I come from the rural communities where this is probably more of problematic than in the larger urban areas. And so I don't see anything in our goal or in the implementation steps that talks about working perhaps with the judiciary or with the judges or with the legislature to expand those courts and services to enhance access and inclusion to justice. It may be that we've done it specifically, that we are simply focusing on, you know, our role as dealing with the attorneys vis-a-vis the consumers. But I think that's an important thing, is to sort of interface with the other component of access to justice. And I don't see anything in here that deals with that.
All right, anybody on staff wish to respond or?
Well, I do think Mark is right. There was a lot of discussion about that, both at our last board meeting, but also among the board liaisons working on the strategic plan. And I think there was some intentionality around focusing on the area that we have control over, so to speak. Because there are many parts of the access continuum. Access to the courts is one piece of it. And I do agree. I also think that the actual issue of courthouses, court locations, court facilities is not a non-controversial one within the judicial branch. I don't think there is necessarily an aligned position about how many facilities there should be and where. And I'm not sure that would be wise for us to get in the middle of that in particular. So those are some of my immediate reactions. Obviously, we can provide support, but that is not an area that where we squarely have agency. So I think the strategic plan reads this way by design.
And Mark, I would just also offer that to Leah's point, that we can continue to support efforts in this area. We can continue to collect data and do the best job that we can in regards to protecting the public through the attorney discipline system, and then showing our various stakeholders that that we should continue to be able to have a voice and to lead in all areas relating to access and inclusion to the legal system, because we've been entrusted with such an important charge, and we're now making these very ambitious steps in our internal strategic planning. So I think that's how we have a seat at the table, perhaps, is by doing this stuff excellently.
I have first of all, good morning. I have a question and a comment. And so I'll start with my comment first. I think this goal looks great. I particularly, when you started talking about the media strategy, I just kind of lit up as I was grabbing my coffee, because one of the things as a public member, you know, I feel like I'm always being exposed to different aspects of the state bar, and I feel like I'm an informed person. And so imagine being someone in the general public who has had no interaction with the legal profession. And I think within the media strategy, just kind of the awareness and the education is key, but also the understanding that, you know, being an attorney can take you in so many different directions. And so if there was an opportunity to engage, I would love to be a part of that conversation. And the other aspect too is the utilization of other stakeholders, because I think oftentimes in certain communities, some people can say things differently in a way that people can embrace and that they trust and understand. And so demystifying the law, I think is an incredible opportunity. The other piece is the diversity pipeline. And I know that there had been previous conversations around this dais around the diversity pipeline. And I would offer that once someone is in law school, I'm not quite sure that from my vantage point, I feel like once you're in law school, I believe there's another way of impacting the diversity pipeline, because getting to law school is very difficult and challenging for the folks that I know who have attended. And so I would love to see some aspect or some opportunity to increase the diversity pipeline before law school, because once you get to law school or once you apply, you kind of already know where you're going and what you're doing. I don't know what that looks like. I know that there have been conversations. I know I've talked to people in COAF, and there's been some thought that, you know, it's not the state bar's place to impact that. I know there have been conversations around high school, but I hope that there's an opportunity to talk about that, because I do think increasing the pipeline is different. Also, what just kind of popped into my mind is kind of community colleges. In another aspect of my life, I worked in community colleges. And when I think of non-traditional students who don't take the route of going to a four-year institution and then going to law school, imagine the opportunity of being able to increase the pipeline of the legal profession through California community colleges. And so just kind of throwing out some other ideas, but I think this looks really great. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Shelby. I see Trustee Sewell has his hand up.
I too just want to, I think just sort of express the detail that I've seen in goal 1 and goal 2, and just in terms of the implementation strategy. And so stop me if I'm getting into the weeds too much on this as a result of that. But first, I would also just like to sort of echo Melanie's comments, because they were some comments that I was going to make, because I'm aware of other professions, whether it is in the healthcare world, in the public policy world, in the engineering world, where we go more upstream, or I guess more downstream, I guess you could say, where you are trying to get folks interested, influence them to potentially go down a specific path much earlier in life, and so would or in their educational pursuits, and so would be very just sort of interested in how we kind of tease that out and flesh that out more in that law school that law school sort of pipeline into sort of legal services and how we look at that. I think the one that I may be getting in the weeds a little bit on is that I'm not familiar with the Mindsets in Legal Education Initiative, and would just appreciate it if somebody could let me know what that is. And if that is something that we should do at a later point in time, I'm happy to get that information later, but I just was interested in hearing a little bit more about that.
Certainly. I think part of the confusion, because worded that way, I think other board members would say, I don't know what that is either, because the name has changed 3 times. Exactly, Trustee Chen. We originally started referring to it as a productive mindset study. Then it became California Bar Strategies and Stories. And now it is Mindsets in Legal Education. And so this is the work that we had done with some researchers from the University of Indiana, Stanford, and somewhere else, USC, where this is something that had not been done for bar exam previously, but had been done in other settings. And they brought it to the bar exam to test providing interventions to students to address stereotype bias, to address imposter syndrome, a fear of lack of belonging, just to see if with a very short, frankly, intervention, it improved pass rates on the bar exam. And the result was that, yes, it did improve pass rates on the bar exam. And as anticipated, it improved pass rates for students of diverse backgrounds or first-gen law students, more so than anybody else. And so it really had a lot of positive results. We have done it, I think, on 4 occasions. There have been a couple of reports that are on our website, and I can certainly link the trustees to those reports from the researchers identifying the results and how they sort of address the stress and the frictions that stand in the way of law students being able to study for the exam and focus on the exam. And so as a result of the success, that's why we had determined this is something that we want to institutionalize going forward. Because it was a study, it was funded through Access Lex. Ultimately, we need to take on the funding to make sure this thing continues.
Donna, could you just talk a little bit about the 2+2+3 program in response to Trustee Shelby's comments about community college and that
Yes.
law school pipeline?
Certainly. Great reference, Brandon. So the State Bar actually incubated a program that in fact embraced the community colleges. It was called the, I think it started as 2+3 and then it became 2+2+3. And so it starts with law academies in the high schools and then 2 years of community college. The next 2 years in a 4-year college and law school. So that's your 2+2+3. And it's a program that is designed to encourage, to bring law to a group of folks who maybe never thought about law as a career for themselves. And starting with folks in high school. And there are a number of academies that are focused on different professions, the Law Academy being just one of them, and really trying to bring into the law people who don't have somebody in their sphere that they have seen become a lawyer. And so they don't know that this is even an option. Doesn't occur to them it's even an option for them. And so really trying to build up that. And this is a program that the State Bar incubated, and now it is run by California Law. And we had a fairly extensive conversation at a board meeting a number of years ago about the importance of the role of having sort of incubated the program, but not then continuing to operate it working with California Law as needed to ensure that they're able to continue to do that good work. But that's exactly really sort of hit the nail on the head, Trustee Shelby, on something that we had done some focused efforts on in the past.
You know what would be interesting? You just sparked something. You said the State Bar incubated the program and then passed it on. If there are other sorts of DEI efforts that the State Bar has incubated, those are great things and passed on. Those are great stories to share with external constituencies, particularly the legislature. And so it would be wonderful to get an idea and maybe within this goal as it relates to DEI is, and I don't want to get in the weeds, but maybe something around to the extent of communicating broadly the history and the work of the State Bar as it relates to DEI efforts within the pipeline. Because that's the kind of stuff that people need to know.
And I'd say the one other initiative that occurred to me when you were speaking earlier, Trustee Shelby, was something that was launched by the Council on Access and Fairness, where they did some videos of non-traditional lawyers, meaning non-traditional ways that you could be a lawyer. And so there was a video by, I believe, the GC of the Golden State Warriors, right? And just like, so people who think basketball don't think lawyers, and really just highlighting, and there were a couple of those videos, and that was something that I think they were going to try and continue to work on to identify other sort of non-traditional, appealing kinds of ways that could make somebody say, oh, never thought about law as a career. That's an interesting thing. I could see myself doing that.
No, and I think that that's an important point, that the bar can continue to play a role in collecting stories and then passing those on to our stakeholders to show exactly what we are doing in this area. I mean, I can think of many stories just coming from Bakersfield, which is predominantly Hispanic. The population is predominantly Hispanic, and the steps that are being taken by Cal State Bakersfield. I mean, Dr. Janine Craybill has a pre-law program that partners with the community college there, and then also with, you know, law offices, public defender's office, district attorney's office, and bringing people up through this pipeline to where they feel, where these students feel a part of the community and then stay in the community. My wife's working with a young lawyer who she met at Bakersfield College. She's now a lawyer and is now working with my wife on various things. So it's just having people stay in the community where they know those unique issues. I think it's absolutely something that the State Bar can do. I mean, I was at a Cal State Bakersfield Hall of Fame presentation. Dr. Paula Parks has a program called Emoja, and she works with people of color to make them feel a part of the education system and use language and a community oriented approach to have these students continue on through their studies. And I want to say the graduation rate for her group was astronomically high. It was like, I want to say 80% and so creating that sense of community, I think, is absolutely something the State Bar can collect the data on and then model for the rest of the state. We can continue to be leaders in this. All right,
So,
any other?
One more comment. I feel like the incubator, the fact that the State Bar incubated the idea of the 2+2+3 program, and Trustee Shelby's, excellent comment that we make sure that this information gets passed along. I think that this fits under the third bullet point that's up on the screen under goal number 2, implementation of DEI. I think that one of the things that the State Bar does best is it's able to bring together various constituents and various, organizations involved in legal services, and collecting and collating those best practices and letting people know about it. So having worked on these issues at my firm, I know that and attended numerous DEI conferences, and it constantly feels like the wheel is having to be reinvented, and people will say like, oh, we should do X. And it turns out there have been other organizations or other firms that have already done it, but there isn't a great way for information sharing. Sometimes it happens at these conferences, but it's really dependent on who happens to be there. And the State Bar can serve as a clearinghouse for that information and get it out there. So one thing that I've talked about a lot is our firm has a program for this pipeline to law school that you've talked about, Melanie, and we rolled it out a number of years ago and have iterated and, incorporated lessons learned over the years. But we bring in each year a class of predominantly Latinx and Black college students who have no experience with the legal profession. They don't come from families with any experience, with any lawyers. And we introduce them to people in all facets of the profession. So we introduce them to judges and people who practice in public interest, people who practice at big firms. We pay for their LSAT prep. They come in weekly, and we give them coaching on how to do a good interview, how to polish your resume, how to prepare for law school, and do this sort of positive mindset type interventions. And it's an awesome program. People have gone through it and gone to law school, and some of them are now out there and clerking for judges and working at law firms. And so it's been really successful. And there's no reason why we couldn't create a toolkit that other organizations can use. So I think the State Bar can play a really powerful role in gathering all that sort of information.
Yes.
First of all, our minds are aligned, because when you were saying it, in my mind, I was saying toolkit. I was like, there needs to be a toolkit. But what else dawned on me is, and I know that the State Bar convenes annually, there's a diversity summit, but wouldn't it be interesting engaging chief diversity officers, because the diversity in the legal profession, I think about the California Public Utilities Commission and the work that they've done and other public stakeholders. But imagine, having a track, and I feel like I'm getting in the weeds and I won't, but imagine having a diversity conference where you are engaging chief diversity officers within the legal profession to talk about their experiences. But I think the toolkit is masterful. So yes.
I would just comment that in the past couple of years, the first two diversity summits that we held were large and sort of open to everybody. Bad way to describe it, but you'll see when I contrast it. The last couple of years, we've had sector specific diversity summits, and we focused on public sector. We focused on nonprofit. We focused on private, and private included firms as well as in-house. And so we actually did have some chief diversity officers attending that. And there had been a feeling, one of the reasons we broke into the sector specific summits, feeling that, well, our issues may be somewhat different than the issues, the private sector versus public interest. And so we had sector specific summits so we could focus on the issues that folks were telling us were more important and most important to that sector. And so that's something that I certainly would see us continuing. And one of the things that is actually identified here is helping at the local level, helping local bars and affinity bars do sort of more regional, more local summits like that. Again, sort of using the resources of the State Bar, whether it's creating toolkits, being a repository of incredibly important and rich data sets, or sort of providing sort of outlines and some funding support to be able to launch these diversity summits throughout the state.
So just, I have a couple comments and then kind of a question, a process question. But one, I think this idea of us as an incubator extends well beyond DEI. And thinking about our role as an incubator and how we communicate that out. When I was looking at goal 4 while you guys were talking, because that one has the fewest implementation steps. I think it's sort of the weakest, but that to me is where that belongs. I'm thinking about the work we did. This is a DEI work. One example is that the work we have done to look at racial disparities in our system. That's something that I really do try to lift up a lot with other regulatory agencies, but it is something really important that we've done that's more in the disciplinary space. When we look at that probation redesign, and I know Arnie asked, is anybody else using this risk assessment tool? No, nobody else is even looking at their recidivism rates. And that's is sort of an idea that we should be lifting up and sharing with other jurisdictions. So I think that concept does extend beyond our DEI work. And then sort of my process question is, it sounds like we need to make some amendments. An approach could be that we ask the board to adopt what is presented today, and then for staff to come back with some additional adds. That's what I would ask, rather than holding off on adoption, so that we can. And then the last piece I will say, I should have mentioned this at the onset, that underneath this level, so to speak, will be an operational plan. That's at the staff level. That's much more detailed, but how we're actually going to get the work done. And that's another place where we can fill in some of the gaps that are potentially identified today.
And Leah, if I could, Mr. Chairman, that would be my strong recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I see that, Sonia.
All right. All right, I see Sonia has her hand up.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I'm in a better place now, I hope.
We can.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. First, I really would like to thank Ms. Pai and the team and the working group for this really incredible work that I feel as a trustee, having broken down what we are supposed to be doing and all that, that I feel that I can have more personal contribution to advancing the work of the State Bar. Looking at goal 1 and 2, and as many people know, that I really am so glad that we have the loan repayment program that we're going to implement, and that's something that I would be interested in. I also would like to, and I haven't really looked at it honestly, but I just also want to want to find out if there is a scholarship program in that where we can have them to promise to work in the area where we would like for them to be. So not just a loan repayment, but more of a scholarship. That's something that's, just going into details, but that's something that I would hope to be able to discuss. Also, I really echo Trustee Shelby and Sol have said, and among other things, and of course, on the basis for public members. As a public member, I would like to, on the consumer side, not the law student side, but on the consumer side, I would like to see us being able to work with immigrant groups that are not just not in addition to the groups that the state bar is funding and all that, but really work with them, because from the Philippine American community, they would not know what the state bar is doing. That are other immigrant communities that we can go to. So I would like to see that also as part of our implementation, where we can go and see and let them know, this is how we are able to provide our services to the common, the public. And so that's something that I would like for us to be able to discuss and work on. In terms of visibility, again, you know how we have different months celebrating, and this is hopefully not too much of the detail, but I would like for the state bar to also be prominent, like in the AAPI month of May. What are we doing? Or in the Women History Month. Those are the kinds of things that probably we can also bring our programs so that we are visible. And so this is the kind of things that as Trustee Chan was saying, that we just need to, and Shelby, just to communicate what we're actually doing to the public more. I think that's all I have for now, but I just really want to thank you all for the work, our work here. That right now I feel very confident of what I can contribute and what our trustees and the staff can contribute to really protecting the public. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Trustee Dillon. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brandon. So I'll jump off of what Sonia just said. Apart from the confidence that I'm feeling about sort of where we are and where we're going, I'm also very encouraged to see the common threads and recurring themes in the various discussions that we're having, particularly partnering with stakeholders and collaborating with people. When Trustee Shelby mentioned that your lights went off in your mind about your Donna's discussion about the knowledge gap. As you were talking about it, I was thinking to myself, this is a great opportunity to collaborate, coordinate. I'm not sure what the right word is, but to remember that the CLA, the California Lawyers Association, is out there. They've got a very specific role serving lawyers, but it's certainly to their benefit and their members' benefits for Californians to know when they need legal help, right? That's just sort of a business driving thing. But from our perspective, it's an access to justice and access to legal services thing. And so there's a nice little bit of overlap. And I think that we should, not forget that they are a player out there for us. Just the great example, by the way, was yesterday, Brandon, your work with Justice Curry and Melanie, Heather Rosing. She's very active in the CLA, and we took some action yesterday on something that is a very good example of that sort of cross-pollination and work. So good stuff, all of it. Thank you.
All right, any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none, thank you all for your work in this area, and Cassandra, to you and your team for taking our energy, our unbridled energy, and distilling it down into some achievable and measurable goals. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, absolutely. I believe Mr. Duran is up, Mr. Chairman's up to talk about goal number 3. That was a really great discussion and warms my heart to hear you all talk about the goals, strategies, and then starting to think creatively about implementation. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Ms. Pai. I agree wholeheartedly. I am going to use the prerogative of the chair and call for a 5-minute bio break. Mind refresh your coffee and get up and move your legs a little bit, and we'll be back here in 5 minutes if that's okay. Thank you. Reconvene. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Those trustees who are remote, we look forward to your continued participation and thank you for everybody's contributions and input so far. We're going to move over to goal number 3, which I have the pleasure of introducing. I'm not going to read everything that's on the screen, of course, but you know, again, the common themes here of what we're all talking about and working on really relate to the strength of our system. And this goal number 3 is sort of the meat in the meat and potatoes meat pie that we've got. I've got some really bad similes today. I apologize. Metaphors or whatever. I must be hungry. That's right. But we protect the public, of course, by regulating the profession and admitting lawyers, giving lawyers the tools they need to stay competent and ethical practitioners. And so certainly as a practicing lawyer who works for public agencies, I find it truly the most important part of my job. And I know that I've got hundreds of thousands of colleagues throughout the state who came to the law because they want to serve the public and serve justice. And so we're going to talk about what the State Bar can do to continue to promote the ethical practice of law. And I'm very pleased and encouraged that over the last many months, perhaps a couple of years, the conversation has included not only disciplining and regulating lawyers, but helping lawyers so that they can serve the public well, and we can prevent the misconduct that leads to the number of cases that we're the high number of cases that we're prosecuting through the Office of the Chief Trial Counsel. And so you see the vision there that we have licensees that exemplify excellence and personal responsibility in the practice of the law. Certainly there are many, many rules of professional conduct that go specifically to that. But this general notion of just serving the public effectively and ethically and competently. You see the strategies there for each of the 4 areas that we've been talking about for each goal: effectiveness, consumer focus, et cetera. Again, I won't read them to you, but I do hope that we can engage in a conversation, getting into some of the details of filling out this aspect of our mission. Yep. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Bridget Grammy to discuss the implementation of this goal number 3.
Thank you. Likewise, I'm not going to go through all the different bullet points, but just kind of wanted to hit some higher level implementation goals that we have and some that we've already been working on with this. So as the chair said, the goal is really being proactive in regulating, trying to be smarter about regulating and really prevent client harm before it happens instead of just waiting for complaints to be filed after people have already been harmed. And so you heard one example of something that's already underway we've talked about already is the attorney supervision and assistance redesign, the ASAR project that Ms. Mellock talked about yesterday. You heard about the risk assessment tool that we're talking about. Those are the types of programs and really implementing that all the way through that will help to really, in that case, try to target recidivism, look at what kinds of interventions and support we can provide people that are on probation already and try to prevent them from coming back into the system. And then from an effectiveness standpoint, we're talking about using data. So we'll now have a baseline data for us to be able to assess how effective these interventions are, how effective these programs are, and be real intentional about evaluating that to see what we're doing going forward. The other really big key part about this is expanding our education. We have, as you know, a 5-year plan already to expand the learning management system. And we're developing self-assessments for attorneys so that they can check in on themselves to see how they're doing as far as different rules of professional conduct, ethical practice, and competent practice. And we're also looking at developing specific programs for and bringing back the DEI issue of, different attorneys who may struggle or who may be from disenfranchised communities are more likely to have unique practice management issues. We're looking now at how to develop specific programs and educational tools and support systems for those attorneys and building that into the Office of Professional Competence going forward. And then the last thing, again, that we've heard about a lot is the client trust account protection program really fits into this model too, as being, hopefully, if we're able to implement it as we would like, we can do more auditing, that type of proactive regulation to try to stop things before the clients are harmed. So those are some of the big picture implementation goals.
Thank you, Bridget. Questions, comments, thoughts?
So one thing that I, just picking up on the conversation that we had yesterday about the civility study and the changes that might flow out of that, including a new rule of professional responsibility, or as perhaps, I can't remember, Chair Duran, if you had mentioned this, but an ethics opinion, for example, I do think it's important to, and maybe this falls under the DEI bullet point that's already up there, is to think about the things that hinder retention of attorneys of color in the profession. A lot of the prior goal focused on pipeline into the profession. So focused on law school, getting into the profession. But all the studies show that once you're in the profession, there's a huge exodus from the legal profession at around year 7. That's when attorneys of color leave. And if we're going to have a diverse attorney population, we need to also focus on that retention point. And here might be the place to do it. And I think it, the CLE that we talked about talking about civility and how incivility in particular affects people, attorneys of color and women, I think is important to talk about. And since we're already doing it, I think it can be part of this bullet point.
Thank you for that. I wholeheartedly agree. And I have to tell you, Hylin, that what you said yesterday, just that phrase about incivility and its corrosive effect on attorneys of color, and it stuck with me because that's a very powerful imagery, right? And people come to the law wanting to do great things and wanting to live good lives, and it's tough. Anyone else? Brandon.
So I just want to recognize Ryan Harrison. He's the vice chair of the Council on Access and Fairness. And he and I had a conversation last year about issues relating to mental health affecting younger lawyers and lawyers of color, and different studies that are being done in the area of imposter syndrome, and how there's a growing recognition that that historically disenfranchised communities experience imposter syndrome when coming into the legal profession. And so, to Ms. Chen's point, I think we can position ourselves as a disseminator of studies, disseminator of resource materials to really speak to these very real issues affecting all lawyers. I think we can continue to show leadership in that area, and it could be as something as simple as a resource page on the State Bar website, where if individuals come to the State Bar website and search for those resources, then we can hopefully point them in the right direction. I think one other thing that really deserves, that should be talked about as far as our work in the advancing of competent professionals here in California, is recognizing that the practice of law takes so much from lawyers personally, from a family standpoint, from a mental health standpoint. And that if we recognize that, then we should also be able to provide steps forward. I think every practicing attorney in this room, and then public members, whatever profession you hail from, know that these long hours that, long hours working for clients, working to advance their interests, sometimes our own personal health, our own personal mental health takes a back seat to the, the interests of our clients and the organizations we work for. So I think to recognize that and to provide a path forward, showing that the practice of law can involve a holistic approach to life, where you work on your sleep, your diet, your exercise, and how all those things really come together to create a professional that the public is confident in taking their deepest, darkest problems to, and having that person advocate and give that advice, knowing that that professional has approached their own life in this holistic sense, and make sure that they're the best possible person. So I would really like to see us continue to push some of those ideas forward. I think one of the best MCLEs I ever went to was entitled "Why Good People Do Bad Things," and it was Dr. Robert Simon who talked about how you have these 20, 30-year professionals and everything comes undone in a split second because of a series of escalating circumstances in their life, whether it was lack of sleep, stressful situation, and it all leads to this cataclysmic event. And so when we're talking about protecting the public, we need to be giving our licensees resources in how to address stress, because this is absolutely a stressful profession. So I want to applaud staff for putting this on our plate, knowing that we have a lot on our plate, but I think our licensees and the public of California, the public of California really deserves that.
Thank you, Brandon. I see Sonia has her hand up. Trustee Dillon?
Thank you. So thank you, Trustee Stallings. I think mental health would also be for older, the more seasoned ones too. But one thing that I really would like to see is how we can help them in with respect to client trust fund would be financial literacy. And coming from a financial industry, I really would like to take on providing financial literacy to this time the attorneys, because it's very different, especially just having my son. I think I would, who is a new lawyer, I would like for him to really understand what it is, and my institution provides these financial literacy programs, and that's something that I would like to see us take a lead in doing that for the attorneys. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Dillon. Trustee Shelby?
Yes. Trustee Stallings, you said something that took me back to earlier in the week watching the confirmation hearings for the presidential nominee to the Supreme Court. And she talked about, in her opening remarks, she apologized to her daughters in relation to the time that it's spent for her to navigate her very storied career. And so that I think what you are offering there just makes a significant amount of sense. And then I wanted to kind of direct this to Trustee Chin, in relation to retention. I'm curious if within retention, is advancement a part of that as well? Because I certainly know that for disenfranchised communities, and we were kind of having a conversation about this last night, when you don't see yourself, you're not really quite sure how to navigate. And mentoring comes in so many different, I have certainly, some of my most, I guess storied is my word for the day. I read it this morning, but some of my most storied mentors have been white men, right? Who have just seen my worth and my value in my profession and navigated and opened doors for me. But I was fortunate because I've got an outgoing personality, but there are so many diamonds in the rough. And so how for, people of different orientations, how for people of different ethnicities, and for women, I think advancement and mentoring in that piece becomes a really important aspect as well. So I just wanted to add that. or ask that if
Yeah,
mentoring is part of
totally
that.
agree that advancement is a significant piece of retention, and the data bears it out that, even though people of color and women, well, the numbers for women are stark because women have been entering the legal profession in almost equal numbers for many, 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 many years. But then if you look at who stays and who advances to positions of leadership or partnership, it's still mostly men. So, and the same thing bears out if you look at people of color. So absolutely advancement is a piece of that.
Truly great conversation about strengthening the legal profession, right? Strengthening how lawyers can practice and succeed ethically and competently. And my watchword for the day is toolkit. I don't know whether there is a toolkit scenario for this piece of for this implementation of this goal, but there are basic precepts that a healthy mind, a healthy body, a healthy approach to the rules that we all live under. I mean, and as the promulgators of the rules, I think we have to recognize that that's an important piece of, advancing the profession and protecting the public. Anybody else?
I'm looking at these implementation steps and I don't see a lot about these issues that you're just raising. So I just wonder if when we take it back, maybe we can add some of the wellness piece to this implementation step.
I do think retention and advancement is specifically called out in goal 2. And then I think where we intended the umbrella for what you're having the conversation about now is this provide effective support for attorneys experiencing practice management and other challenges that affect competency, but it's wrapped into competency rather than wellness.
And then just one final plug, for lack of a better word, the policy change that we've identified there and implementation of the client trust account protection program. I mean, that's a direct result of the bar, facing a very public, very ugly problem, and putting some resources to it, putting some good minds to it, having discussions with folks like the Ad Hoc Commission on the Discipline System and others. And so I continue to be very appreciative of not only staff's leadership, but the volunteers who are interfacing with us to support programs like this that make a meaningful difference in clients' lives, and hopefully lawyers' lives, right? Okay, let's move on to goal number 4, Ms. Wilson.
You were gonna do the goal piece. Do you want me to take it, or you were gonna do, I think, this slide? And
you're doing implementation. That's right. Thank you. So goal number 4 is to protect the public by engaging partners. And again, here echoes of many conversations we've had over many months, but a very meaningful piece of what our strategic plan is for the next 5 years. We want to engage our stakeholders to enhance public protection and restore the state bar's credibility, reputation, and impact. Because truly, without having that credibility, it almost rings hollow to try and do some of the things that we're talking about. And it certainly makes it easier for us to interface with the legislature, for example, every year when they're reauthorizing our licensure fees, right? To show to them and to the public that we are good stewards of the funds that they've entrusted to us for the benefit of the regulatory system, for the benefit of the protection of the public. And so our vision is to actively engage those folks, to garner their support for our mission as well. And it's almost like comrades in arms. And because I do have to believe that the many stakeholders with whom we work, whether it's the Supreme Court and the judiciary system, whether it's the legislature, whether it's the California Lawyers Association, all of us do have this common goal, this common mission of protecting the public. And we do it here at the State Bar by implementing initiatives and programs and services. And so let's do what let's talk about how we're going to actually continue that work of engaging our stakeholders. The strategies that you see there to increase public trust and consumer awareness, again, echoes of many of the conversations we've just had with respect to the first 3 goals. Making sure that we've got a consumer focus, right? And I have to tell you that I truly value the input of all of our colleagues here on the board, but in particular the public members who are, you folks are very often very clear to us lawyers that the perspective that you bring is informed and being informed by working as part of this group and learning what the bar does. But it's a great reminder that, this is not only lawyers regulating lawyers. This is the public regulating lawyers. And so I'm appreciative of that. Of course, as Brandon and Leah have suggested, our DEI is built into our DNA, right? It's built in, not bolted on. And so how do we ensure that our communications materials reflect that reality for us? And actually, I think that we've done a good job of that because we're conscientious about it. But it's good to talk about how we can continue to do it better in reaching out to the diverse communities, whether it's rural folks in the far, California is such a huge state. It's not just Los Angeles and San Francisco and San Diego. I've got a client at the Oregon border, and they face very real problems in serving remote places. And so, how do I, as a lawyer, contribute to the wellness of those communities? And how do we, as regulators, contribute to the wellness of the lawyers in those communities? And let's talk about the systems and policy changes that we're going to implement here. And with that, that'll be the introduction to Ms. Wilson.
All right. You can advance the slide. And this one, based on our conversation this morning and just doing another read of it, I think these implementation steps likely need the most work. I'm going to speak to a couple of them. And just to say sort of the foundational premise for this goal is that our success will be built on our relationships and on our reputation. Right. And in both regards, we're somewhat challenged. So the focus and the emphasis is on restoring and building relationships and similarly restoring our credibility. So how is it that we're going to do that? So one is, again, back to that concept of being transparent, holding ourselves accountable, and providing others with the means to hold ourselves accountable. That's what that rather bland bullet means about increasing access to our data and our performance outcomes. Another aspect of this goal area is bringing in the consumer voice. This is another way that we hold ourselves accountable to our mission. And so when we talk about that in sort of from a very concrete point of view, it relates to things that we've begun to do, like real baby steps around, but looking at who is on our committees. When one of the things we talked about yesterday was supporting the Cork bill, supporting the bill that would allow to make permanent this remote participation in meetings. And often that's talked about as a measure to save public funds, which of course it does. But it also increases access, the types of people that can sit on the committees, because it's very few of us proportionally that have the kind of jobs where we can take off for an entire day or more, travel to and from. We have other people to take care of our childcare responsibilities or whatever responsibilities we have. And so when we think about sort of lifting up the consumer voice, it translates to very concrete things like that, or efforts to ensure that the public understands what we are proposing and can actually make comment on it. So that is another way where we bring in the consumer voice, and in doing so, hold ourselves accountable to our mission. And then you can see under consumer focus, but I think it also needs to be added under DEI, is this create and sustain partnerships with other organizations. And this is something, Melanie, you have hammered this in on us since I've been back at the bar, and you're right. And our lack of these partnerships gets us killed every time. I can see it now looking back retrospectively at many of our challenges as an organization. And so it's really working hard to figure out who are our partners. We have some perhaps natural partners in bar associations and bar affinity associations, and some less natural ones that we need to cultivate. And so that is the intention around this goal area. And again, I think that partnership theme, it's there under consumer focus, but it also belongs under DEI. And of course, ultimately, why do we want to have this? Why do we want to restore or build relationship, restore reputation? It is so that we can be effective, right? We have, as reflected in the strategic plan, some really bold and innovative ideas and things that we want to do as an organization. And those of you that have been around for a while know that we have over the years had ideas and innovations that we've wanted to advance. And we've been hindered in doing so because there is a lack of confidence in the credibility of our organization. And so without that, we really can't do anything else. So that's sort of the theme here. I'm not sure the implementation steps fully capture it, but that is the intent behind this goal area.
Thank you, Leah. Folks, thoughts, questions? Trustee Shelby.
So I loved what our executive director just said around success will be built on our reputation and relationships. And what really struck me is that critique is not always criticism. It's sometimes awareness. And we've talked before, and I think at the beginning of this process, we talked about, PTSD. And I began to think, and I'll preface this by saying, I think that everyone involved in this process has done incredible work. And so I probably have not lifted that up, and I apologize. I've just gone straight to where I think we could enhance, but please know that I am very impressed with where we are in this process and just appreciate everyone's time and effort, to Ms. Pye, to the committee, to the team internally. I just think we're moving in the right direction. But what struck me is, where does the internal focus reside? So in our mission, we're talking about a lot of external things, but where do we then focus on our team, right? Where do we focus on employees of the State Bar? Where do we focus on vendors? Where do we focus on experts and partners that we bring in? And I don't know if that is here, but as the team goes back and looks at it to blow it out a little bit more, I think that here would be a great place to do that, because we can't have a mission that is protecting the public if we don't protect, 645 full-time employees that make up this organization. So I would like to throw that out there.
I think that's a point very well taken. And I will admit to sort of taking for granted that the person on my left, that's how she operates at all times, but it absolutely should be reflected somewhere in a document like this. And so it's not fair to just assume that Leah's always got it under control. You do, but certainly we should put some words in.
Something that we did talk about, because in the current or the old strategic plan, we had an explicit goal focused internally on fiscal and personnel operational management. And we've certainly talked about it at the leadership team level, like it's visibly missing from this entire strategic plan. But in many organizations, I would say, when you look at their strategic plan at that level, there isn't so much of a focus on the internal operations. But when I mentioned the operational plan that we will be developing, and that is going to be built from a lot of the work we've done internally to have staff weigh in on what they think our priorities need to be, that's where you're going to see the nitty gritty of all of our investments in our human capital to be able to achieve what we're talking about here. But I agree, it's missing. I think we could try to visibly build it into the plan. I'm not so sure it fits with the way the goal is currently constructed, but I can assure you that it is going to be front and center in the operational plan.
And Ms. Pye, I have to tell you that I'm very glad that when I looked up to give you the mic, your hand was already raised. So I suspect that we are thinking along the same lines. Please.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about throughout this conversation is the beginning of this process. And as I think many of you know, I had the honor and the opportunity to do most of the one-on-one interviews. And as most of you also know, we asked the same series of questions. Most of the interviews ran between 20 and 30 minutes. It was a great opportunity for me to learn more about your organization, but also for me to hear from external partners and stakeholders, their thoughts and views, and in some cases, critiques, criticisms, and reflections, but I just wanted to say, to piggyback on something Trustee Shelby said. I heard a lot of good things. I heard a lot of positive commentary, and I want to just say to all of you and to Leah and the staff that there's some really great opportunities to develop some of those relationships and partnerships that you've all talked about. Because there are many who want to do that, who are standing by with hands extended to want to be partners. And so I again, like Ms. Shelby, much of what we heard was not negative. Much of what we heard certainly was thoughtful and has led to a lot of the good thinking that's in this document. But we also heard a lot of very, very positive, constructive feedback that I think you've got a great foundation from which to start. So I hope that's what you were thinking about, Mr. Chairman, but maybe it was something else.
It was very close, so thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate that perspective. Trustee Tony.
If I could make a comment, I, volunteered to be part of the working group. Very pleased that was able to work very closely with Ms. Pye, with Chair Duran, with Vice Chair Stallings, and go through a process of evaluating, looking at all the surveys, surveys from stakeholders, interviews with board, both board members, people inside, outside the organization. And there was an earlier conversation about looking at, well, could we get this approved at the January board meeting, the strategic plan? And I was one of the people who very clearly said, I think it's too early. I think we need more discussion. So what I'm pleased to say is that since that time, the board took up the strategic planning at its February special meeting. We had a whole session devoted to strategic planning. The strategic planning work group has met several times since January, sometimes on a weekly basis. And I guess I'm saying that all to say, from my standpoint, I feel very comfortable that we have gone through a thorough process, and one which I feel very comfortable with. And I certainly would be prepared to recommend that the board adopt this strategic plan. Of course, if there are remaining strong issues that people have, certainly we can entertain it. I don't presume that this is the be all and end all in terms of every piece of wording. But I think the intent and the meaning of all the comments that have come in today are incorporated and are embedded in this document. And I think that this document is something we will refer to on a regular basis. And I'd just like to, not to cut off any further conversation, but to indicate my support for this. I would like to place a motion for the board to adopt this proposed strategic plan.
Thank you, Trustee Tony. The motion on the floor to adopt the strategic plan as presented, and then also as we anticipate a few little minor additions and corrections coming soon. Is there a second on the motion, and we can engage in discussion or debate?
I'll second.
Trustee Cisneros, thank you. And Trustee Sewell, please.
I almost feel like this could be left unsaid, but I just wanted to acknowledge that it's hard to distinguish which of any of these goals is more important than any of the other ones. They're all so important, but I think we've all come to realize that this goal number 4 is really sort of critical to our ongoing sort of success with our stakeholder community and the programs and the processes that we hope to sort of see to fruition as envisioned by this entire sort of strategic sort of planning process and the goals that are articulated here. And I just want to appreciate the fact that that this one's on here, that there's been an awful lot of thought that's been given to it. I heard Ms. Wilson say that, you know, maybe all the implementation points aren't completely sort of detailed and fleshed out, but I think overarching, it leads me to this conclusion, and that's this. That we want to be accessible, we want to be transparent, we want to be responsive, and in so doing, that means that we want to be, you know, be inclusive and have folks involved and engaged in our processes. That doesn't necessarily mean that they may necessarily like the decisions and the outcomes that are eventually sort of formulated, but I think I've come to learn over time that, you know, if you include folks in the process, that they, whether or not they like the outcome or not, they've been a part of the process, and that goes a long way. And they'll keep coming back, and they'll keep wanting to be involved.
Thank you, Trustee Sewell. Any other comments from trustees, staff, anyone?
Really
Trustee
quick
Chen.
comment on goal number 4, as State Bar staff is working to operationalize these items, I want to make sure we don't lose sight of an issue that was discussed when we were discussing strategic planning, which I think a number of us raised. I think it was Trustee Bratton and I might have raised that a key constituency is lawyers themselves. I think often we talk about communicating to the legislature or to the broader public or electorate, or it just attorneys, most of them think of the state bar as, you know, they're there to suspend you or disbar you. And I think we perpetuate that view often by, you know, we produce an annual discipline report, which provides metrics about discipline, but all the other awesome things we do, like the mindset intervention or whatever it's called, or well, maybe that'll be the 4th name, you know, but there's just so many different things that the state bar does that attorneys don't know about. So every year they pay their fees and nobody knows what does this go to pay for. So I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of that very important audience.
Hear, hear. I completely agree. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. If you put the resolution up on the screen so that folks know what we're voting on, it's very close to exactly what Trustee Tony said. We've got a motion and a second, and Madam Secretary, if you could take the roll when you're ready, please.
Broughton,
Absolutely, yes.
Chen,
Yes.
Cisneros,
Aye.
Dela Cruz, Delenn,
Aye.
Salag,
Yes.
Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony.
Aye.
9 ayes, 1 absent. The motion carries.
Bravo. Good work, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased. Ms. Pai, thank you to you and your team for your able leadership and guidance and getting the juices flowing. So I feel very good about what we've done here today, and let's continue. Let's keep it up. Let's use it as the beginning, not the end of this.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the working group, to the staff, and everyone involved. We've really enjoyed this work, and we're proud of it and really proud of you. So thank you so much.
I look forward to seeing the printed product with cool pictures.
Not printed,
It's on the digital project.
Digital.
Excuse me.
Come on.
I'm showing my age. Okay, that concludes our open session business, correct? Yes. So we will convene into closed session to consider that one last item on our closed session agenda. We have 3. I apologize. Wishful thinking, right? Three remaining items. That's right. Anyway, we're going to go into closed session. Thank you, everyone. We made the announcement yesterday. Should I make it again, Vanessa? As to what we're discussing in closed session? I think we're okay. And we're concluding the closed session we started yesterday.
Trustees attending remotely, you should receive a link shortly.
Okay, we'll see you in closed session in a few minutes. Thank you, everyone. Into open. Now we're live and recording, convening back into open session after our closed session. Just to say that there was no reportable action from any of the discussion at closed session this afternoon. Thank you once again to the trustees and to our staff for the fine work over the past day and a half, and safe travels everyone to get home, and thank you very much. Good work.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We're adjourned.